welcome to today's book talk with Dr. Pierre Losson, who will be talking about his book titled The Return of Cultural Heritage to Latin America, Nationalism, Policy, and Politics in Colombia, Mexico, and Peru. This event is presented by LANE, the Latin America Northeast Network, which is a part of SALAM, the Seminar on the Acquisition of Latin American Library Materials. And for those who may not be aware, LANE is comprised of libraries on the northeast of the United States. And these include, for example, members such as Bronx Community College, where I am located, Harvard University, the Library of Congress, and so many other different institutions across the nation. And LANE allows us to collaborate with one another. And we have many members here of LANE, and actually enough SALAM as well. And this event is co-sponsored by the Bronx Community College Association of Latino Faculty and Staff here at Bronx Community College as well. I am Nelson Santana, co-chair of LANE, and my colleague here, Ms. Allison Williams, is also here. She is co-chair of LANE. And we also have a former co-chair of LANE, Professor Jesus Alonso Regalado as well, who is present with us, as well as many active members of LANE. The chat will be monitored. It is here. And if you have any questions or suggestions, you can send either Allison or myself a comment, and we will get to you as quickly as possible, as we've been doing already. So for today's event, Dr. Pierre Losson, he will be talking about the return of his book project, which is a dissertation turned book, The Return of Cultural Heritage to Latin America, which takes a new approach to the question of returns and institutions. It is the first publication to look at the domestic politics of claiming countries in order to understand who supports the claims and why. The book proposes explanations for why Latin American countries are interested in specific objects held in Western museums and why these claims have come to light over the past 3 decades. Dr. Losson is currently the Associate Director of the CUNY Dominican Studies Institute. He graduated in International Relations from the Institut d'Etudes Politiques of Strasbourg. I apologize, I do not, my French pronunciation is not there, so I apologize. He also holds an MA in Arts Administration from the University of Lyon, France, and an MA in Latin American and Caribbean Studies from Florida International University, and a PhD in Political Science from the Graduate Center, so another product of CUNY. And Doctor, I yield the floor to you. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Nelson, and thank you so very much for this invitation. It's, always for me an honor to be invited to speak about my work. So, so really, thank you so much, and especially for this kind of audience where I know that we are all Latin Americanist, and we are. We all hold this region and some countries very dear in our hearts. So thank you again for the invitation. As an introduction, I thought I would maybe discuss just a little bit how I came to be interested in this topic and where I'm coming from when talking about it. As Nelson kindly described, I did my PhD in political science, and this is definitely a discipline that has had no much interest for culture in general, and certainly no interest in this question of the return of cultural heritage. So I think I hope that what I can bring to this discussion in this book, which again, as Nelson mentioned, also is adapted from my doctoral dissertation, is really to try and focus on a different dimension of this question. Especially because when I was reading, and I started reading early about this, actually, when I did like a master thesis on the topic 20 years ago in an arts administration program. I was a little frustrated because everything I would read would either focus on the legal aspect of return claims. That is, whether a country has a standing or not in claiming a specific object based, for example, on what is written in the 1970 UNESCO Convention on the topic, on the 1995 UNIDROIT Convention, on directives from the European Union, or in bilateral treaties. For example, the US has several such treaties with Latin American countries, including Peru, including Mexico, El Salvador, and others. So all these texts imply the recognition that there are objects that were displaced illegally. But the problem is that there are many objects that are contested and that have been taken away from their original context much before these legal instruments were created. And I found no explanation or no interest really in trying to understand why we would claim these objects that were displaced so long ago. My other frustration with what I was reading was that a lot of the discussion seemed to turn around what would happen to Western museums, and particularly how returning objects could endanger the model of what we call universal museums. So we're talking here about these big repositories of the history and culture and arts of humans, such as the Metropolitan Museum here in New York, or the British Museum in London, or the Louvre in Paris. But in the end, I was not reading anything about what was going on in the claiming countries. And that was for me really interesting because I wanted to avoid naturalizing return claims, as if we would naturally be interested in claiming objects from our past. And I think that it is very important, and this is how I want to consider this, is to see heritage as a social construction. So we are educated in caring about the remains of our past. And if we do not take this as a standpoint, it is difficult to understand this series of questions that I'm seeing, that I wrote down here. Why do we ask for the return of objects of which we're not the legal owners? Why are there some objects that we are interested in and not others? What kind of objects are we interested in? So in general, what do these return claims tell us about the domestic politics of the claiming countries? So this is really what I'm trying to look at in this book. And of course, one more thing that I'm trying to do is to really look at this from the perspective of Latin America, which is not a region that has usually been studied in books or academic articles about this subject. A lot of the literature revolves on cases such as Greece. You've probably heard about the Parthenon marbles that Greece has been claiming from the British museums for decades. Italy, Egypt. More recently, there has been a lot of talk about the Benin bronzes. But I feel that the literature has not had so much interest in Latin America. So the way for me to maybe introduce you more to the topic is to give you a little bit of context about each of the case studies that I'm using in this book, because I think that each of them is really in itself a fascinating story. So I wanted to tell you a few words about each of them. For my studies, I used 3 countries of the region, Peru, Mexico, and Colombia. And for each of these countries, I focused on 2 case studies. This with the idea of being able to do comparison among all these topics. So the first, all these cases have one thing in common, is that the claiming countries, so Mexico, Peru, Colombia, did not have a legal case to claim these objects. mostly because these objects were displaced before, again, the existence of international legal text on the topic. Which is also why I'm using the word return. I'm trying to make a point that I think it is better to distinguish with a different word these cases from those of, for example, restitutions. All the legal instruments that I mentioned before allow for objects that are now seized in customs, for example, to be returned, to be sent back to their country of origin without much political discussion, because those have already taken place when the treaties were being drafted. So again, all these cases here are about objects that for which, even though there is a legal and a judicial component in many of these stories, it is very unlikely that the claiming country could have obtained a decision from a judge to send them back. So the negotiation really has to be political. So I'll start with Peru. And with a story that I think some of you may remember from a few years ago. It's that of a collection of artifacts that were excavated in Machu Picchu by archaeologist and explorer Hiram Bingham, who was sent to this area by Yale and the National Geographic Society between 1912 and 1916. He took back with him to Connecticut a collection of approximately 5,000 objects with the agreement of the Peruvian government at the time. The caveat here was that the agreement specified that the objects should be returned after 18 months. And indeed, the Peruvian government did request the return of the collection on at least 2 occasions in the early 1920s. Each time Yale asked for an extension, claiming that Bingham had been sick, that he had been sent to Europe during the war, so he was not able to complete his studies. And each time the Peruvian government agreed to these extensions. But the memory of the collection seems to have faded after this. And pretty much until the 1990s, there was no further attempt by Peru to obtain the return of the collection. Which was actually used by Yale throughout the decade of the 2000s to claim that the statute of limitation had expired, and that if Peru had shown no interest in the collection for so long, then why was the country interested now? So one thing that for me was interesting in this case, and I will mention similar facts with the other case studies, is that it really all started again thanks to an individual. In this case, a lady called Mariana Mul de Piz. She was the widow of a very famous Peruvian historian, and she made it her personal project to unearth the memory of this collection and the history of the collection. And she is the one who found the documents that later became the basis for the Peruvian claim. And as has happened with the other cases that I will mention later, she was then sidelined once once official authorities took over. She this happened in the I'm not sure why there is stuff showing up on the screen, but I hope maybe it's just, I don't know if it's just me seeing it. This happened at a moment during the transition from the authoritarian government of Fujimori, and Alejandro Toledo was elected president in 2000. So the conditions were better for this claim because, in part, because Toledo's wife had inspired an indigenous revival of Toledo's political figure. And so it became important to claim this attachment to the past. But I will go back to this later. Basically, after a decade of really bitter negotiations between the university and the Peruvian government, the university was really isolated, even with its own alum. There were alum groups pressuring the university to return the collection. And so they, in the end, the university agreed to send it back in 2010. And the collection is now housed in Cusco, in a house that belonged to the National University over there. My second Peruvian case, I'm going to stop sharing and I will do this again because there are, again, there's stuff on my screen. I'm very sorry about that. Okay, I hope this is better. My second case study is that of a collection of textiles from the Paracas culture. They are funerary textiles. Mummies were packed with those textiles and then were buried in the desert. And so that's how they were found in very good conditions centuries later because of the very dry conditions of the desert south of Lima. This case is pretty different because the textiles were taken from Peru in the 1930s by a Swedish consul who had bought the textiles on a market in Lima. There were already laws protecting cultural heritage in Peru at the time, but really the Peruvian state had no capacity to enforce them. And that's how this Swedish consul was able to purchase them in an open market, take them with him back to Sweden. He donated them to the museum of the city of Gothenburg. Around 2008, the museum really took a different curatorial approach, which is something that I did not mention in my introduction, but I think is important. While we have a lot of resistance in the biggest museums worldwide against returns, I think there is also a current towards decolonizing museums that that looks at the history of collections and admits that if we can prove that these collections have been unethically formed, then it is a logical step to look for their return. And I think that the Museum of World Culture in Gothenburg kind of took this approach in 2008 by presenting an exhibition that was called A Stolen World, where basically the museum was presenting the textiles at the same time that it was acknowledging that they had been stolen from Peru decades earlier. So a logical step for Peru was to claim the return of this collection. And also this is happening at the same time that the country was looking for the return of the collection at Yale. So there was much media attention towards these cases in Peru. And the negotiation really was not that difficult to agree to the return in itself, because there was really an ethical commitment to return these textiles early on from the museum. It took years, though, to process the return, but for technical reasons. And the museum wanted to be sure that the textiles would be cared for in Peru in at least as good conditions as they had been taken care of in Sweden. And the entire collection has now been returned. Moving on to Mexico, you may have heard of the story of the Penacho de Moctezuma, which is actually an object about which there is much uncertainty. We do not know exactly what it was used for. It may have been a headdress, but it's not entirely sure. Did it belong to the last Aztec emperor? That is not sure either. It may be that of a priest. So there are competing theories about what the object was for. We do know that the object was sent to Europe in the early 16th century, so that this is very early after the Spanish conquest. But it isn't clear in which conditions. It may have been stolen. It may have formed part of a gift that maybe was made to the conquistadores when they arrived. And it is because of these ambiguities, in part, that the museum has refused to consider the Mexican request for its return to Mexico. Here again, the Mexican claim really rose from the activism of individuals, particularly that of a tourist guide who was performing indigenous, and I'm going to use like quotation marks around indigenous here, or maybe neo-Indian, as some anthropologists would call them, on the main square in downtown Mexico City. And he organized a group to tour Europe in the mid-1980s. They went for several summers consecutively. They would tour several European capitals, and then they would end up the summer in Vienna, in front of the museum, and organizing indigenous traditional dances to raise attention towards the penacho. So fast forward 30-something years since then, the Mexican government took over the claim. So once again, we see here the original claimers, those individuals who got interested in the story, being sidelined. The museum has used a lot of arguments to refuse the return. At some point, saying that there was no official claim from the Mexican government, which was really interesting for me from a political science perspective, because really what the museum was saying is that there never was a letter signed by a Mexican president asking for the return. But I did find many official documents coming from different state entities that clearly mark the intention of the Mexican state to obtain this return. And over the past decades, the main argument that has been used is that the penacho is too fragile to travel. And that has momentarily put an end to the discussion until the election of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who again started the process, but with no result. Another interesting thing about this object is that at least since the 1930s, it has been used to promote some form of Mexican nationalism rooted in the pre-Columbian past. I put here two pictures of the penacho. One, at the bottom left, it's the original one in Vienna. And on the bottom right, it's a copy that was made in the 1930s, and that is currently the National Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City. And it's really like one of the main pieces in the museum where people stop and they take pictures of themselves as if they were wearing the penacho. And so it has really been used in this construction of a national or nationalist narrative. I will get back to this topic in a little bit. My second case study from Mexico regards a series of frescoes that were looted from Teotihuacan, the site of the very famous pyramids just north of Mexico City, in the 1960s, at a time when there were archaeological excavation being conducted, and that seemed to have allowed some looters to rob them from a housing compound. That was before the 1970 law in Mexico that strengthened state control over all antiquities, but there were already laws in Mexico at the time. And it was also before the 1970 treaty between the US and Mexico on the illegal export of antiquities. Because of this, when the collection of frescoes was donated to the De Young Museum in the late 1970s, a judge in San Francisco found that the museum indeed had a good title to keep the museum. However, the De Young, especially at the time, was really an art museum and with no expertise in the conservation of this kind of materials. So the museum reached out to Mexican authorities to try and establish a collaboration, which happened, but also, of course, unleashed a Mexican claim for the return of objects that had been illegally displaced from the Mexican perspective. So this case is really interesting because first, the kind of solution that was found to the dispute was really original at the time, which is that half of the collection stayed in San Francisco, the other half returned to Mexico. And again, this is really interesting because I think it shows us how much the debate on these questions has changed. I think it is pretty much impossible that in 2024, a museum that would acknowledge that the origin of some part of its collection was looted from another country, but would still be entitled to keep half of it. I think this is just unimaginable today. However, this agreement had some virtues as well. First of all, it did start a collaboration between the museum and Mexican authorities, particularly the National Institute of Anthropology and History, for the conservation of these specific cases. But also, it started a long-term collaboration. So several exhibition and research projects started between the museum and Mexico on the basis of this agreement. Several exhibitions organized by the museum then toured to Mexico. And so I think this is important because it shows how this conversation on returns and on cultural property does not necessarily need to be seen as a zero-sum game, but rather as the beginning of a different conversation. And so I think that this is an example that has to be kept in mind in many of the disputes today, because it can be the start of something else. Moving on to my Colombian case studies. The first case is that of a collection of 192 objects in gold from a funerary bundle that was unearthed in 1890 in the region of the Quindío, which is now famous in Colombia because this is the region where coffee is produced. And at the time, it was scarcely inhabited. At the time, most grave diggers who found gold would melt it for the price of the materials. However, this collection in particular was so spectacular that the grave diggers saw how peculiar it was and sold it to one of the very few collectors of pre-Columbian art at the time in Colombia. In those years, the Colombian president Holguin was also looking for a way for Colombia to participate in the best possible way in the Hispanic American exhibition that was to take place in Madrid in 1892. This was very important because Colombia, because of the political turmoil and financial scarcity, had not been able to participate in some of like the famous universal exhibitions in London or in Paris in the previous years. So Holguin was really adamant about participating in this exhibition in Madrid. The exhibition took place, and when it closed in 1893, Holguin gifted the collection to the Regent Queen of Spain. Officially, because the Queen had arbitrated in a border dispute between Colombia and Venezuela a few years before in favor of Colombia. Now, the rumor has it in Bogota that Holguin, having been the Colombian ambassador to Madrid, he was actually the Queen's lover. And so that there was a really personal dimension to this gift, more than that of a gift from a state to another state. And it is this gift that two separate citizen initiatives in Colombia used to contest the fact that this collection is now in Madrid at the Museum of America, and to claim that the Colombian state should be seeking its return. Now, and here we get into one of the specificities of my Colombian cases, which is that these citizen initiatives found no echo in Colombian bureaucracy and among elected officials. So the only way left for them was through the judicial system. So there was a series of of trials in administrative courts until finally the Constitutional Court in 2017 decided in favor of the plaintiff and ordered the Colombian executive to do everything possible to negotiate and obtain the return of the collection from Spain. Nothing happened for many, many years until the election of Gustavo Petro in 2022. And there now seems to be, and I'm going to use here a hypothetical because I am not privy to the conversation, but serious negotiations would be taking place now with the Spanish authorities. And finally, my last case for Colombia is that a collection of 35 statues from the archaeological site of San Agustin in southern Colombia. There is here a parallel with the situation in Machu Picchu because Preuss, who was a German archaeologist, visited the region in the 1910s. So it is really in the same year that Bingham was in Machu Picchu. He took those 35 statues without authorization, sent them back to Berlin. And here again, it is because of a citizen initiative that Colombia started being interested in the return of these statues. A group of citizens who live in the village of San Agustin today, who started pushing the executive to act for this return. For years and years and years, there was no reaction or interest in the Colombian executive. So here again, they went through the tribunals to force the Colombian executive to negotiate with the German museum. Here there are some developments. There is a German delegation that visited San Agustin last year, and we are now being told that that the statues may be returned maybe later in 2024. I'm being cautious here. I'll believe it when it actually happens. But I think this is here. This is also a case that is interesting because it comes from developments within Colombia, but also from I think the changes in the international environment around this question. The Humboldt Forum in Berlin, where the statues are right now, was very criticized when it was created 3 years ago for still embodying this idea of a universal museum and having a very conservative approach to the history of its collection. Since then, Germany has actually been at the forefront of the movement towards decolonizing museum and trying to do a significant effort at re-evaluating the history of these collections. So, for example, in the case of the Benin bronzes, Germany was the first country in announcing that it would return to Nigeria all the Benin bronzes in public collections. So, like logically, what would logically follow would be other cases like these statues that are widely acknowledged as having been stolen from another country, well, should be returned as well. So now that I've told you a little bit about my cases, I want to tell you a little bit about some of the conclusions that I develop in the subsequent chapters in my book. I have 3 main chapters through which I try to really go from a macro level of analysis through a micro level. So my macro level is really that of ideologies and ideas and their influence. My mid-level analysis is that of the construction of public policy, which is still a little disembodied, I suppose. And really my micro level is really looking at the actions of individuals. All of this for me is important because I wanted to avoid, as I was saying in my introduction, to naturalize return claim, but also to try and take a little more complex approach, because sometimes we'll hear that, okay, Greece wants the return of the Parthenon marble. Who is Greece? At some point, someone has to embody this abstract entity that is the nation state. So starting with this macro level, I of course got interested in the role that those return claims use in the construction of nationalist discourses in Latin America. And that was for me important because one of the main arguments that has been used by universal museums to push against the idea of returning parts of their collections is that they embody the values of universalism against the selfishness and egoism of particular nationalism, without much analyzing what those nationalism entails, right? It's very much pushing this idea of right-wing extremist nationalism, as we can maybe think about in the context of Western democracies. I wanted to understand what it meant for countries in Latin America. Nationalism is a long-term project in Latin America since these countries became independent starting in the 1810s and 20s. And the new states had to compose with ethnically diverse populations, the Spanish Creoles, indigenous people who were, of course, not unified either, African descendants who were not also a unified group, and then the mix among all these groups. So the states had to find something on which to build a sense of national unity. And that's where the pre-Columbian empires were useful, much in the same way that, for example, in a country like France, we refer to the Gauls and the Romans as our ancestors. I'm describing this process very, very broadly because, of course, it changed a lot over the course of a century and a half. Maybe paradoxically, it is a sublimated indigenous past that was used in this task, and certainly not contemporary indigenous people. Little by little, states managed to impose this idea of a legitimate monopoly on the use of the past, which is an expression that I'm taking from Paula López Caballero, and that I really like to describe how the state became the sole legitimate owner and manager of cultural heritage in Latin America, in other countries as well. Of course, and archaeology was the modern science that was put at the service of this project. Of course, the meaning of the nationalist and the message of the nationalist discourse has changed over the course of 2 centuries of history in Latin America. There are at least 2 concurring ideologies that I think were very important in that sense. One is indigenism, for example, in the case of Mexico, following the Mexican Revolution, and starting in the 1920s. Indigenism was a very influential ideology to not only reconnect the contemporary nation to its glorious past, but also to actually try and re-evaluate the contemporary indigenous population through their assimilation in the national mold. Later in the 20th century, multiculturalism is another ideology that I think became very influential, particularly in a country like Colombia, where indigenous population are numerically less important, yet have managed, for example, in the 1991 constitution, to gain an official recognition of their difference. And I think those 2 ideologies influence the way these countries have been claiming and dealing with the management of their national heritage. So basically, a conclusion for me in that chapter is that, sure, Latin American countries do claim the return of cultural heritage because of nationalism. I do think that we have to understand nationalism, again, as an ideology to build unity among on a very diverse population, and not necessarily as a particular expression of one political current within the polity. Now, a related question that arose for me was that if nationalism influences return claims, then why do we see return claims becoming more prevalent in the 1980s and later decades until today, and not before? I found there, I think, several possible explanations that are all interrelated, and that can explain the feeling of crisis of the nation state in the region starting in the 1980s, and that may have pushed the state to seize this kind of symbols to try and repositioning their symbolic power as the embodiment of the nation. So those factors that contribute to a sense of crisis, I think, were internal armed conflicts between the state and non-state armed actors like the FARC in Colombia, Shining Path in Peru, even the Zapatistas in Mexico. Migrations. How do you speak to a population when millions of your co-nationals are now living abroad or are internally displaced and may have lost this sense of a root in a peculiar place? Democratization is a factor because, as I mentioned, a lot of these claims come from the activism of individuals or civil society actors. So that presupposes a polity in which one can actually challenge the state on certain topics, such as, for example, a national or nationalist narrative rooted in the conservation of cultural heritage. Neoliberalism as well. The 1980s are in the end 90s are decades of implementation of neoliberal reforms, which have forced the state to withdraw from its traditional role as a purveyor of social services, but also as an economic actor. And I think pushed the state to maybe refocus on other questions. For example, its symbolic power as the embodiment of the nation. And I found one conclusion in this chapter too, which is that if we look at return claims through the lens of nationalism, then I think that return claims are much more useful as long as the objects are actually not returned. Because a non-returned object can be used to reformulate permanently this nationalist discourse. Once the object is here, and we see this, I think, in the Peruvian cases, where 10 or 15 years now after, or not 15 yet, but 10 something years after the Machu Picchu collection was returned and is now in Cusco, does not really attract much attention anymore. Well, for a decade, it was really used as an emblem of the country, both internally and towards other countries. So I thought that this was a significant conclusion for me in this chapter. Now, moving on to my mid-level of analysis, that of public policy, I got interested in how return claims play or speak to the formulation of three different types of public policy in three different areas. Cultural policy, of course, but also economic development and foreign relations. In regards to cultural policy, I felt that it gave me also a different type of answer as to why return claims appeared until the late 20th century. And I really believe that it is because Latin American states needed to strengthen their own management capacities before they could claim the return of yet more objects from other countries. This was particularly important because one of the main arguments that has been opposed by Western museums to return claims have been that the objects would be endangered if they were to be sent back to their country of origins. So, but Latin American states throughout the 20th centuries have built their capacities by building more and better museums, by educating experts who speak the same language that curators speak in Western museums. In terms of what it means to, in terms of like conservation, of display, of study of an object. So basically, Latin American states became legitimate interlocutors in those conversations. And again, like an idea that I just mentioned before, but I think that there is overall a paradox for me, or maybe it is not a paradox actually, that Latin American states have strengthened their cultural policies, have institutionalized culture as a legitimate field of action for the state, which is maybe symbolized by the creation of ministries of culture in all these countries. At the same time that the state had to retrench from other areas of activities, such as economic production or the delivery of public services. So a second field or area of public policy making that I was interested in was that of economic development, and particularly how return claims relate to the development of cultural tourism based on the commodification of cultural heritage. I am not arguing here that Latin American states claim the return of objects in order to boost cultural tourism. I think that would be a really functionalist argument, and I find no link here to argue this. But chronologically, it is really significant, and particularly in the case of a country like Peru, which reopened to tourism in the decade of the 2000s after being almost shut down completely throughout the 1990s because of security concern during the internal armed conflict with the Shining Path. So it was a way for Peru, by claiming loud the return of the Machu Picchu collection particularly, to claim to the rest of the world that the country cared for its cultural heritage. And it did serve, indeed, as great advertising for the country. And then the third field of public policy making that I got interested in was that of foreign relations, particularly reading the archives in foreign office ministries. It's really striking how throughout the negotiations, diplomats are having a really hard time reconciling different objectives, which is that, so for example, in Vienna, Mexican diplomats are asked to negotiate the return of the Penacho de Moctezuma. At the same time, what they are trying to do is to negotiate a free trade agreement between Mexico and the European Union. So those become really conflicting objectives, because you can't really go to the Austrian Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the morning to argue about the Penacho and then come back in the afternoon and try to get better conditions in the future free trade agreement. So those for me was really interesting. Interesting findings. One thing that was also interesting in terms of foreign relations was how, and again, that might be a paradox, because we may think as the US as like the strongest diplomatic opponent for Latin American states, and European countries are more on maybe friendlier or with a simpler relationship than the US. But on the specific issue of return claim negotiations, those are actually easier for Latin American states with the US, because in the case of the US, they can negotiate directly with private museums. Big ones like Yale, like we're talking about very big institutions, but with pretty much no or very little involvement from the federal government. Well, in the case of Europe, all the museums, or almost all museums, are public, which means that the state can never really negotiate with the museum itself. It has to go through public authorities in those countries and the embassies of these countries at home. So it makes for considerably more complex and longer negotiations than in the case of objects that are in American museums. My last slide, and I'm sorry if I'm being long, is at this about this micro level of analysis that I was mentioning earlier. I really wanted to look at who precisely in each country was interested in these return claims. And I found a series of actors that we see reappearing in all these countries and in all these claims. One that was really a surprise for me was those individuals from civil society that I have already mentioned. Most of the stories that I told you about really exist because there are individuals who got interested for some reason or another, got passionate about these objects and started lobbying their own state. And I truly believe that Colombia today would not be claiming the Quimbaya collection, would not be claiming the San Agustin statues if it was not for the activism of these individuals. As mentioned, they get sidelined once official authorities take over. But I think their role here is essential. And for me, particularly important, again, thinking about Colombia, because the negotiations that are now taking place, as I mentioned, on the case of the San Agustin statute, completely exclude these people. So we are now in the situation which I think speaks quite poorly of the state of democracy in the country, of a state that took over and is now not really consulting with the people who first showed an interest in the matter about what the future of the statues will be. So if the statues return to Colombia sometime in 2024, at this point, nobody knows if they will go back to Bogota in a museum. Maybe they will go back to San Agustin. Where in San Agustin, nobody knows. And I am concerned that these actors are not consulted. I think it is again really a flaw of this return process as it is currently happening. A second category of actors that we find in all cases are those of heritage and museum experts. As I mentioned, usually they are the ones who take over once the state is involved, because they are the ones with the professional capacity and legitimacy to care for the objects. There is an Australian scholar, Laura Jane Smith, who coined this term authorized heritage discourse, which I find particularly telling to describe this, again, this professional language that experts in any Latin American country share with their counterparts in Europe or in North America, and which makes them legitimate interlocutors, and which makes them possible caregivers for the objects if they are returned. The third category is that I'm calling here political entrepreneurs, which could be really elected officials at the highest possible level. I always find interesting that both the museums in the West and the experts in Latin America will say that heritage should not be politicized, which, again, if you consider cultural heritage as a social construction, makes no sense to me, because it is by definition political, because it is used to define who we are as a society, as a community, as a nation. So it is by nature political, but also for another reason, which is that in all these cases where, again, as I mentioned earlier, there is no legal basis for the return, a return does not happen if there are no political entrepreneurs presidents of the republic that are going to put some political capital into the dispute. Yale had to agree to the return because President Toledo and after him President Alan Garcia fought personally for those returns by calling Barack Obama, by publicizing the topic as much as they could. So this politicization is actually necessary for a return of this nature to happen. And a category of actor, and this is for me interesting, and I mentioned it a little bit earlier as well, that specifically was involved in Colombia are the judges. And I think that this speaks a lot about the responsiveness or lack thereof of political officials in Colombia towards their own society, that at the same time as it is positive that individuals and civil society have this judicial channel to be able to hold the state accountable towards its own actions and towards the norms to protect cultural heritage that the state itself has enacted. But it does speak poorly of political dialogue between society and state that that civil society has to go through the judicial system to be heard. And finally, the last category of actor that I'm trying to analyze is that of indigenous communities. So I want to be very careful here. I'm not an anthropologist. I want to avoid reifying indigenous or what indigenous can mean in Latin America. That said, we are talking about objects that are pre-Columbian historically, yet I find very little interest by indigenous communities, or at least the indigenous leaders that I was able to interview for this project, in those specific objects. I think they are, of course, very interested in the question of cultural heritage in general, but not specifically these objects. And I think that this is because these objects have really been nationalized. The state has succeeded in making this heritage national. So it is possible, indigenous leaders today in Colombia, for example, or in Peru, can absolutely tell you that an object, yes, is of indigenous heritage, but it is first and foremost Colombian or Peruvian. And I think this is also interesting because from a US perspective, maybe we tend to see First Nations as distinct from the national community or forming separate nations, while I think that in Latin America, there is, on the contrary, this intent to be considered national. We may be indigenous, but we are also the nation. We are part of this nation. So I think that this is really important and in that regard. I think this is what I wanted to say, and I'm really sorry I spoke for so long. Oh my God, it's been an hour. Thank you so much.
Bravo, bravo. No, wow, Dr. Losson, thank you so much for this talk. I mean, this is a very serious matter, very serious conversation. And I'm glad that people are having it. And I think many of us are happy that you actually took the time to study this area and provide. I'm not sure you, but I received several comments on the chat, and we actually received some questions as well with regards to your invigorating talk. And I can tell you, I mean, I'm pretty sure you can go for another hour or two because there's just so much to unpack and share here. But I don't want to scare anyone. And I don't want to scare you either. Do not leave us.
Yeah.
So I mean, wow. So I guess, is it okay if we jump straight into the questions at this point?
Yes, please.
Okay. So If there's anyone who has a question, you can actually type it into the chat or the Q&A box that we have. If you want to remain anonymous, you can send me a private message or even input it into the Q&A. But two questions that we received here in the Q&A box, and I don't think the people who asked these questions necessarily need to remain anonymous. So first is Professor Jensen Ortiz from the CUNY Dominican Studies Institute, or City College of New York. Are there any lessons or recommendations that policymakers, cultural institutions, or activists can draw from your research to improve the repatriation process or address related challenges in the future?
Yeah. Yes, thank you. That's a very wide question, because I hope that there are lessons or recommendations at several levels, actually. I would say, if you are claiming, or if you are interested in the return of an object, what you can learn from these cases is that you need to build a political coalition. Yeah, that's lesson number one. Like, if you do not get the involvement of elected officials at the highest level, you basically stand no chance of seeing this object. And the cautious tale is that even if you succeed, you may be completely sidelined. And this is where, like, really the question of like internal political games and the type of political support that you can obtain comes into play. Now, I think recommendations or lessons that can be learned is also what happens after an object has indeed been returned. And I think I hinted at this a little bit. I feel that we have contrasting examples here. The example of the Teotihuacan murals, which as I mentioned is could be criticized today for like allowing a museum to keep objects that were looted, but has really allowed the development of a long-term collaboration. So again, this, and I think I mentioned that it is extremely important for me to not see the moment of a return as the end, because that would only make a return like a moment of, I don't know, revenge, to say it maybe very negatively, maybe reparation, if we want to see it in a more positive light. But there is much more that can be done in terms of encouraging new scientific projects, artistic projects, and in general, trying to avoid the most strident nationalist part of those claims to take over, in the sense that an object can be both national and find its place within the border of the contemporary nation state, and still be universal, as in valued, seen, researched by people from everywhere. So I think those can be reconciled. While really, like, the example, I think, of the Machu Picchu collection shows us what should not be done. So basically, this collection is now in Cusco. It is in a house that belongs to the National University there, but the people in charge are still the people who were the curators of this collection at Yale. I am not here judging what they do with it, in the sense that I do think that they are professionals and they are very, they're good at what they do. That's not the point. My point here is that it makes virtually no difference that this collection is in Cusco or is in Yale, because nobody else has access to it. There is no Peruvian scientific community that can have access, that can maybe propose a different interpretation of these objects, do research. Like, even this collection has a very small part, about 200 objects, that are museum pieces, in the sense that, like, ceramics that are complete, like just nicer, more visually pleasing objects. So those are presented in the house where the collection is kept. But the museography of this is still the same museography that it was at Yale, focusing, for example, on the personality of Hiram Bingham as the discoverer of Machu Picchu, when part of the Peruvian claim was to actually try and show that Hiram Bingham did not discover anything. Of course, people in the area knew that Machu Picchu was there. He got to Machu Picchu because local peasants took him there. But in the end, this narrative is not being challenged or changed through its presentation in Cusco. So I think these are lessons that can be drawn.
Oh, thank you so much. The questions just keep flowing in. So, I actually, leí su libro, and I have some questions, pero for another time, I will not be greedy. I will not be selfish. Next question from Professor Marta Lursky from Lehman College here, also part of the City University of New York. With regards to the textile from Peru, you mentioned, Dr. Lawson, that in 1930, there were already regulations about moving heritage outside of borders. I've heard of international regulations in the 1960s. I may be mistaken. Was Peru an early creator of regulations, i.e. movements of cultural objects?
No, not particularly. I think we're just talking about two types of legal instruments here. I think I was really thinking about national laws. So, and like really all Latin American countries in one form or the other started implementing or passing this kind of law really very soon after independence. And then there's like another movement around the turn of the century in the 1890s, 1900s. But those are national laws. And I think that what maybe you are in the international regulations that you are referring to, yes, indeed, this is a movement that starts in the 1960s, particularly the 1970 UNESCO Convention. But those are, it's not that they are not compatible, but in a way that because a foreign state is never bound to enforce the laws of another country, and this is actually something that has been put forward in the US, that, well, the US does not have to enforce Peruvian law. So as long as something has been introduced into the US in conformity with US laws or international treaties, whether or not there is a law in Peru does not support a claim for a return. So the two are not opposed, let's say. But which is what makes the cases that I'm looking at so complicated, because really for any objects displaced earlier than 1970, there is no legal international instrument to cover this.
Oh, gracias. Okay. Ooh. You're generating discussions here. And my goodness, you might have to start a working group within the CUNY, or I don't know, maybe throughout the US. Question number 3 from Dr. Norma Fuentes Mayorga from the City College of New York. Why do you think indigenous leaders in Latin America are not interested in these claims or in the significance of these objects in their national history or present sense of belonging and identity?
Yeah. So again, I'm going to be cautious about how I answer this, because I really do not want to claim to be any specialist in this. I think part of it is because the objects that I'm looking at have been displaced for so long that the connection with the object has been lost. We are also talking about, and again, this is where the analysis of what it means to be indigenous is complicated, is that those are not the same indigenous people, right? Nobody is the heir of Teotihuacan today. The Quimbayas Even some people in Colombia today who claim to be Quimbayas, they know that they are neither genetically nor really culturally related to the Quimbayas who produced these objects in gold 1500 years ago. And pretty much it's the same thing in all the cases that I analyze. The same with Machu Picchu. Like there is even the people who are like, nobody is Machu Picchu today, even though the indigenous identity in the Andes we know is extremely strong. But Machu Picchu is not claimed by a specific community locally, which again does not mean that indigenous people or communities do not care about cultural heritage. They may care about other things. So to give you an example from one of my interviews, a lady in Peru was telling me that what she was interested in, and maybe something that she would like to see return to Peru, were textiles that she had seen in a museum in Madrid. Why? Because people in her community, they still, I don't know how you say that in English, like tejer, how do you say that?
To crochet.
Yeah, I mean, whatever technique is used. And those were techniques that she did not know how those textiles had been made. And she was like, I would like to have those textiles because those textiles would help us understand why it is that what we're doing today, we're doing it this way and not that way, and things like that. So, but these specific objects, again, that I'm studying, have lost direct connection. So they were somehow available for the state to nationalize them. And that has happened. So in the end, there is no need, I would say, for a specific indigenous community to get involved in this because the state is doing the work. And again, indigenous communities, at least the people I spoke with, do not dispute the fact that the objects may be indigenous, but they are national because they want to be national.
Muchas gracias. Thank you. Thank you. My goodness. There are just more questions. There are more questions coming in. So the next question is from Mr. Darryl Mundy, who works here at Bronx Community College. Brilliant, man. In your research, did you look into what percentage of those artifacts were destroyed during the 2 world wars?
So I do not have quantitative analysis here, definitely, but I can observe like a few things on this, which are interesting. Those are arguments that have been used actually by claiming countries to say, look, you say that you cannot send us back these objects that we want, but these objects are in your museums and there have been 2 world wars. And so please don't tell us that these objects are safer in Europe than they would be with us. So specific examples, the Penacho de Moctezuma was put in like a reserve somewhere in the National Bank in Vienna during the war. And the San Agustin statues, I know that they moved to some basement in the museum in Berlin, which is why they escaped the destruction in of the city in 1945. I do not have again statistical elements, but let's say that those objects had sufficient standing to warrant special protection during the armed conflicts in Europe.
Thank you so very much. The questions just keep piling in. Out of curiosity, would you be open to working with a foreign government interested or colleagues in other countries interested in starting the process for return of cultural heritage, cultural objects, if that was presented to you? I mean, the one country that I have in mind, of course, I'm just selfish, the Dominican Republic, for instance, but just out of curiosity, would you be open to doing this type of work?
Yes, I'm kind of doing it now in the case of Colombia. That's like me going native, as they say in anthropology, I think. Um, like, because yes, in the case of San Agustin, after my research and my interviews, we kept in touch, and I'm very modestly trying to help these people know what they're doing, and I'm just, but so yes, no, absolutely. Look, for me, this is really, there is no right or wrong. And also I'm trying to make this point, I think, in my book. And maybe to nuance a little bit what I was saying before about lessons and that can be learned. Because there is no legal case for those returns, I really think that it is important to look at the merit of each claim on its own basis. This also to avoid, like those arguments that, I don't know, we're going to empty Western museums or things like that, right? But yes, I mean, of course, I would be very happy to speak with people who are interested in doing this and supporting them if I think there is some merit in their claim, of course.
Thank you so much, Dr. Losson. We're going to end it there. Some comments have been posted on the chat, which I'm sure you can read. I'm not sure if you want to necessarily address them now. But I want to say thank everyone for being here. As I noted earlier, this talk, with the permission of Dr. Losson, was recorded. Therefore, once the video is edited and final, not that it will be edited, we're not going to do anything weird, no AI or anything to this talk. But once that it is finalized, we will share it with everyone. We will post it into the Lane YouTube channel and share with everyone who registered for today's book talk. Any final words that you would like to share with us, Dr. Losson?
If anyone, I think I put my email address over there at the end, but please share it with anyone. I can speak for hours. So I'm very happy to continue the conversation if anyone is interested. Thank you so much, really. I love doing this. Thank you so much for inviting me.